Good morning, friends. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome you to this satellite-based interactive program. It is a privilege that today I have with me Professor Vaibhav Bhai Kothari. He is an assistant professor at Samarpan Arts and Commerce College, Department of English. Friends, today we are going to talk about a very well-known novelist of English literature, Jane Austen. The topic is Jane Austen, a novelist. Before we begin, I would like to give you a brief outline of our presentation. It goes like this, that we shall first talk about the biographical details, then Vaibhav Bhai will tell you something about the historical background of Jane Austen, then I will tell you something about Austen's major works, that will be a kind of introduction, and then Vaibhav Bhai will tell you something about the thematic preoccupations that we find in Jane Austen's novels. Now, have a look at this picture. This beautiful picture was made by Jane Austen's sister. That was at around the beginning of 19th century, and this is the modern version of this beautiful picture. Friends, Jane Austen is a very prolific, prominent, significant and a renowned novelist. Not only the students of English literature, but also the students of other disciplines, and any layman will tell you at least something about Jane Austen. So she is such a popular name today in all the literatures. But also it is true that her novels have been read by many readers all over the world, and at the same time her novels have been celebrated by making into films, revisions of films, also into television serials. She is such a popular name today. Unfortunately, the author herself, the novelist herself, Jane Austen, she could not enjoy the success during her own lifetime because she had to publish her novels anonymously. This is only because she was born as a woman, and writing was considered as a male genre where woman was not supposed to enter. It was a patriarchal social system that in which Jane Austen had entered, and when she wrote her novels, she was severely criticized. She could not, first of all, she published her novels with a pseudonym, a lady, and then anonymously also. So this reminds me, Vaibhav Bhai, of one Greek mythology. It is the story of Philomela. Philomela was a poetess. She was a singer. She had beautiful voice. She was in Greece. This is the story of ancient times. It's a mythology. And Philomela, she was once harassed by Theseus, a knight. Philomela, she started complaining about Theseus in her poems. And then Theseus, he sent his soldiers to cut her tongue. Philomela was made speechless. She was made tongueless, and yet she did not stop singing her songs. She went on singing her songs. People could not understand her language, and yet she did not stop. I think this is what happened with Jane Austen also. Nobody could understand her language, and she was being criticized for being a very domestic novelist, one who writes about petty themes. That's what the traditional critics believe. But this is also true for a woman who lives within the four walls of her family, probably like Richardson or Henry Fielding. Jane Austen did not have the exposure to go out. That's why probably she could not write about the adventures. This Jane Austen, she was not known during her lifetime. Even after her life, we find some of her criticism somewhere in articles or in some reports. But it was around 1939 that the first book came out. Almost 100 years after her death, a book came out called Jane Austen and Her Art. And the credit goes to Virginia Woolf, who around 1929-1930s in her essays mentioned Jane Austen as one of the wonderful woman writers. and she, up to an extent that she calls her the best writer among women. So that credit goes to Virginia Woolf, and that is the best tribute given by one artist to another, one novelist to another, when she calls her the best novelist. So it was around 1939 that people came to know, people took Jane Austen seriously and started giving their opinions in the modern criticism. Again, around 1960s, with the coming up of feminist criticism, Jane Austen was revised. And in 1970, with the coming up of woman or a woman's writing, it says that a woman has special female bonding, and that female bonding is very much there in Jane Austen's novels. So Jane Austen, who was being criticized for being so very feminine, now the feminist critics, the feminist readers, they believe, not only gynocritics, the womanists also believe that a woman has a special female bonding, and that is also known as a sisterhood among women. So after 1970s and womanism after 1990s, now she has been appreciated all over the world by women writers, to an extent that most of the feminist criticism, it begins with Jane Austen. She is also known as the mother of English novel. Like Richardson as the father of English novel, Jane Austen as the mother of English novel. So, it is very interesting to note that in 2010, that is recently, Harold Jacobson, who received a Booker Prize, he is known as a Jewish Jane Austen. So now imagine a writer who worked anonymously. Now her name is used as a nomenclature for Harold Jacobson. So this is the journey that Jane Austen has covered. Friends, now it is time for us to look at some of her biographical details. Jane Austen was, as you can see on your screen, she was born on 16 December 1775 in the village of Steventon in Hampshire County, England. She was the daughter of Cassandra Leigh and the Reverend George Austen. There were 6 brothers and 1 sister. The one sister is also known as Cressida, and Jane Austen was very close to her sister. And because it was such a huge family, in her novels we find that there is no the concept of nuclear family. All her characters are into huge families. The best part about Jane Austen was she was tutored at home, and thanks to her father, and she was sent to school and attended the Abbey School in Reading, Berkshire. This was when women were not being educated, they were not sent for education, and her father, who was also an Oxford graduate, he was a clergyman. He was a very well-read person. He had a library of around 500 great volumes. So he sent Jane Austen to school. That was a wonderful work that father did for his daughter. And this is Jane Austen's house in Hampshire. Today it is turned into a museum, and all her works have been kept. The original documents, manuscripts are kept there in this museum named as Jane Austen's Museum. Now, in around 1801, from Hampshire, her father moved to Bath, and after Bath in 1805, after father's death, 2 sisters and mother moved to Southampton. They moved to their mother's cousin's estate, where they stayed for almost 15-20 years. Jane Austen started writing at an early age, and her earliest known writings date from about 1787. Now she started writing diaries first and letters also. Here I would like to mention that a woman who begins to write, she started writing in a very male-dominating fashion. At the same time, she had entered into a discipline which was dominated by men. She was walking on an untrodden path, and she did not have any ideals before her. There were no great women writers before her, but then she had her own way of writing. And this reminds me of a feminist theory which says that a woman writes, she begins with diary. She begins with her own experiences, that is either with diary or with an autobiography, or she would go on writing letters, because these are the very handy forms. Women who are not trained in poetry, formally trained in writing poetry, it becomes difficult for them to write poetry. Women who do not have exposure of the outside world, it is difficult for them to write about plays because they don't have theatrical details. So for them, these genres like diary writing, autobiography writing, letters, they are very handy. And in the similar fashion, Jane Austen started writing diaries. It is also said that it serves as scriptotherapy, because writing is therapeutic. When there is a cathartic compulsion, a writer needs to write out something, and this is from her letters to her sister Cassandra. It becomes evident that writing was a need for her. Here, Vaibhabai, I remember one incident that is by Indira Goswami. I was reading an article titled "How I Became a Writer." There Indira Goswami says at the end of the essay that writing amidst all my sufferings and amidst all my pain, writing became a golden key. And so it was this golden key, I think Jane Austen also found that golden key at a very early in her age. Some of her earlier works were published anonymously. I think all of her, not only some, all of her works were published anonymously. She never married during her lifetime, and she never had a room of her own. It is also said that she used to hide her manuscripts from her cousins, from her niece, from her nephews. She would write in her private chamber, and nobody was allowed there, because writing was not considered good for women. So she never had a room of her own. She used to camouflage not only her writings but also her personality. She died on July 1870 in Winchester at the age of 41. It is said that she died of Edison's disease, and some believe that no, it was because of tuberculosis. We don't know, but she died at the age of 41. But she is being made memorable by her works, and we know her as one of the most prolific writers of today's time. In her works, we can see Sense and Sensibility. It was actually written in 1795, but first the publishers rejected without reading the script. Sense and Sensibility was rejected because it was written by a woman. She had titled it as Eleanor and Marian. Then during the publication she changed the title and it became Sense and Sensibility. It was the same case with Pride and Prejudice, that she wrote it as First Impressions. It was again written in around 1795. It got rejected and she published it in 1813, Mansfield Park. 1840, Emma, a very well-known novel, 1815. These are her posthumous publications. The first two were published by her very dear brother Henry. One is Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. Northanger Abbey, she had started writing earlier around 1790, but it got published in 1817, and unfinished novel Sedition was published in 1925. So these are the major works. There are also some works like Love and Friendship and some stories by Jane Austen, but these are the major works that we know today, and that is what she is known as a writer today. Critics, one critic, that is Sir Walter Scott, her contemporary, he wrote, it's a great tribute. He says that young lady has a talent for describing the involvements of feelings and characters of ordinary life which is to me the most wonderful I ever met with. So this is one of the best tributes by contemporary writer. And Virginia Woolf, as I said earlier, she called Austen the most perfect artist among women. So these are the popular critical views on Austen. This is the cover page of Austen's book Emma. This is Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. This is Pride and Prejudice. This is Persuasion, Northanger Abbey. And these are the letters of Jane Austen that she wrote to her sister Cassandra. It is said that Cassandra had destroyed many of her letters and also part of her diaries. So now I request Vaibhav Bhai to tell us something about Austen's historical background, because Austen in her novels strangely does not talk about history of her time. So now I request Vaibhav Bhai to tell us something about Austen's historical background. Vaibhav Bhai.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, friends. We know by now that Jane Austen has been wrongly termed as a domestic writer, and in fact I would like to call her the goddess of small things, because she has concentrated upon the seemingly small things of life which nobody wants to focus their attention upon. And like Virginia Woolf, she also talks about the trivialities of life. But in a way, both of them are different writers. Today we are going to talk about Jane Austen as a novelist, but in order to evaluate her novels, we must contextualize her writings, the age in which she wrote her novels, and that was the time in which many major events took place. But as Rucha ma'am told us, there is not a single hint of those events in her novels. There are some stray references about those events. So one of the most world-shattering event was the French Revolution, and as you can see on the screen, that the French Revolution began when Jane Austen was just 13 years old. And as ma'am told us that she had written her first novel, Love and Friendship, before she turned 15. Now, French Revolution replaced old ideals, old world order, but it did not replace them with something new. There was nothing to fill the vacuum with, and therefore the French Revolution gradually turned into the reign of terror. As you can see on the screen, she lived a secluded and uneventful life. She lived in Hampshire and Kent and did not have any idea about the north of England. Now, I would like to mention here that she has written a letter to the librarian of the Prince of Regent, in which she says, I quote, she calls herself, I quote, the most unlearned and uninformed female who ever dared to be an authoress, unquote. And then she calls herself as somebody who wrote on 3 inches of ivory, who painted on 3 inches of ivory with a little brush. So she was immensely modest, and by now it has been proved that she was very well versed in French. She knew a little bit of Italian, and she was very well acquainted with Warren Hastings. She knew her contemporaries, Wordsworth, Byron, and Walter Scott. And if you look at some of the novels of Jane Austen, then you will find that her heroines constantly talk about books. For example, Marianne discusses about some books that she had read with Willoughby, and she was rapturous when Willoughby also talks about those books in a learned manner. At the same time, in a novel Mansfield Park, when Fanny Price moves from Mansfield Park to Portsmouth, she had left her books behind in Mansfield Park, and for that reason she felt very bad about it. She constantly missed those books which she held to be very dear to her, and therefore she became a member of the circulating library. She used to take books from that circulating library, and she wanted to instill that habit of reading to her sister Susan, who was not very interested into this habit. At the same time, her another heroine, Catherine Morland, is also very fond of novels, and we have a reference of Dr. Samuel Johnson. Fanny Price quotes Dr. Samuel Johnson when she moves from Mansfield Park to Portsmouth, and the reference is actually about what Dr. Johnson differentiated between matrimony and celibacy. And Dr. Samuel Johnson had said that matrimony involved some pains, but at the same time celibacy did not have any pleasure at all. So she in a way compared the experiences that she had living in Mansfield Park and at the same time in Portsmouth. So we can stretch our imagination into believing that Jane Austen was a well-read person, and she was just being modest by saying that she knew only her mother tongue and she had read very little into her mother tongue. Now, as you can see on your screen, the French Revolution had a vast impact across Europe, and there was another imminent threat to England from Napoleon. It was an age of Napoleonic wars, and Napoleon was leading his armies across Europe at that time, but there is not a single reference of the French Revolution or the Napoleonic wars in her writings. And later on we will talk about the exact reasons why she does not mention these major and tumultuous events in her novels. There are various charges leveled against Jane Austen. One of them is that she was an escapist writer. Now, a layman or a student of literature who has just casually read the novels of Jane Austen will believe that Jane Austen is an escapist writer. But if we analyze her novels in a proper manner, if we put her writings in a perspective, then we find that she was not an escapist writer. She was the most realistic of them all. When the French Revolution began with the idealism, liberty, equality and fraternity, all the writers who lived in the age of Jane Austen were immediately attracted to this movement. Among them were Coleridge, Walter Scott and Wordsworth. And Wordsworth wrote a poem on French Revolution in which he said, "Bliss was it in dawn to be alive, but to be young was to be heaven." In that way he praised the fervor, the enthusiasm which he felt at the prospects of having a new order in the society of England. But when England declared a war on France in 1773, Wordsworth was completely disillusioned. He was frustrated because the kind of impact that he had envisioned, it didn't materialize in England, because in France there was a large bloodshed, there was a violence on the larger scale, and anybody who was on the side of monarchy was immediately butchered. They were awarded death penalty, and even Jane Austen's brother-in-law was awarded a death penalty in France. So whatever ideals that they had about whatever rosy picture that they had from the French Revolution were completely washed away, because the French Revolution gradually turned into the reign of terror, and the kind of impact that it had on the society of France, it did not have on the society of England. And for that purpose, Wordsworth went back into his own imaginative land. He created some utopian islands of his own in his poems. Walter Scott was also another disillusioned man, and he devised his own strategy. He wrote historical romances. He went to the medieval past to get away from the grim reality of the society, of the after effects of the French Revolution. But Jane Austen was a realist, and she did not go to any make-believe world of her own. She faithfully presented what she felt, what she looked at the English society of that time. And for that reason, we cannot call Jane Austen as an escapist writer. She has not escaped into a utopian world. And from the very beginning, she is a very pragmatic writer. She does not nurse any ideas of social change overnight, and she does not believe that society can be changed in a shoddy manner. But she believes that it's a gradual process, and her concept of class system is also to be looked at. We will look at it later. Another charge that is leveled on Jane Austen is that she was not knowledgeable. And as I had pointed out, Jane Austen had read many books. Her two brothers were in the Navy. Her relatives on the maternal side were directly or indirectly associated with the armed forces in England. So it would be wrong to say that she did not have any idea about the French Revolution taking place, and she did not believe in those. The only reason that I can give is she did not believe in something that could go against her idea of stability and her idea of social order. French Revolution aimed at completely overthrowing monarchy and establishing a new order. Now that was something which was in stark contrast to what Jane Austen stood for, and therefore she could not subscribe to this belief. Similarly, the another charge that is leveled against her is she had a very few social contacts, and she did not merge with people. She did not socialize much. Therefore, whatever social contacts that she had were not interested in the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. So her vision of the world was quite limited on that ground. This was another charge. But as I told you, she was quite familiar with what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. The only thing that the ramifications were not felt on this side of the Atlantic in England, and therefore she did not think it necessary to give vent to those suppressed anger which the French people experienced there. And sometimes she has been compared to Virginia Woolf. If you look at Mrs. Dalloway, written by Virginia Woolf, the novel was written just after the First World War, and there are some references to the devastating effects of the First World War, the rising rate of unemployment, the spate of suicides, nervous breakdown. But the central character, Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa Dalloway, in no way she is moved by these events. She is planning to throw a party when the novel opens, and she gives a party when the novel ends, and she doesn't have any ideology of her own about the war. and the kind of aftermath that it has produced. She is just busy selecting the dress that she is going to wear, the kind of shopping that she would indulge in, and the kind of people who would throng her party. So Mrs. Dalloway is another character that can be compared with the characters of Jane Austen. And William Thackeray has also been charged with this complacency, that he did not write anything about Napoleonic wars. But William Thackeray has given answer to that criticism by saying, I quote, "We do not claim rank among the military novelists. Our place is with the non-combatants," unquote. Now what William Thackeray has said about himself can be equally applied to Jane Austen. She enjoys this privileged isolation of her own. She enjoys this peace that a stable government offers in England, and that she does not like anything to ruffle the feathers which can upset her. And if she had wished, she could have written about French Revolution in her novels, because there are many characters in the novels who are directly associated with the armed forces. For example, we have in Pride and Prejudice a heroine called Lydia who flirts with soldiers. Then we have the sailor named William in Mansfield Park. Then there are Frederick Wentworth and Captain Benwick in the novel Persuasion. So if she had wanted to delineate those events in her novel, she had ample opportunity to do so. But the fact is that she was just not interested in outlining the course of history, because she believed that war is an abnormal phenomenon, while peace and daily routine are here to stay, and therefore she wrote about those things in her novel. There are some critics who believe that Jane Austen did not write about French Revolution because she was the first champion of art for art's sake, and art requires a selection. It has been said by someone that creativity is allowing yourself to make mistakes and exactly knowing which ones to keep. So in art we make a selective choice of mistakes, and if it can be said a mistake, the exclusion of French Revolution, then she was very proud of it. So there is another writer called G.K. Chesterton who described her as a writer content to write, I quote, "a story as domestic as a diary, in the intervals of pies and puddings, without so much as looking out of the window to notice the French Revolution," unquote. And as far as the ideals of French revolutions are concerned, liberty, equality and fraternity, she held a completely different view of those ideals than what her contemporaries felt. She believed that equality is not a practical concept. It is just a utopia. While Wordsworth and Coleridge believed that new society can be modeled on the ideal of equality, where everything would be on the same platform, Jane Austen believed that it's not a practical solution to the hierarchy of class that we have. And for that purpose, in her novels, we find the aristocrats, the landed gentry, the merchants, the farmers. But the thing to be noted here is that there is no hostility between all these classes. There is definitely a hierarchy of classes in these novels, but there is not a sense of vengeance or a sense of revenge in her concept of hierarchy of classes. And another idea that French Revolution gave was liberty. Now Virginia Woolf said that Jane Austen said that individual liberty cannot be achieved at the cost of social responsibilities. Wordsworth had written a poem called The Growth of a Poet's Mind, and it was largely an autobiographical poem in which he talked about the growth of the soul, the spiritual quest of the soul. But Jane Austen believed that it doesn't work in real life. If we can take an individual away from the society, then there are no such prototypes of this tendency in her novels. And if any character transgresses the boundaries set by the society, then she ridicules those characters in her novels. Another thing, when we talk about historical background, we must look at it is Industrial Revolution. Now, it's said that in England, Industrial Revolution came first and modernity came afterwards. And in India, modernity came first and Industrial Revolution came much later in the post-liberation, liberalization era. But Industrial Revolution did have its negative effects upon the society. The society, which was largely agricultural, tended to become capitalist society, and it gave birth to a new kind of class called capitalist class, which was in stark contrast to the landed gentry. Now, if you look at the novels of Jane Austen, she does not favor this new money-minded business class, and in her novel there are some characters, there are some families, for example Dashwoods or Woodhouses, Elliots, who are old-fashioned feudal families, and Jane Austen prefers those old feudal families to new merchant class, and she makes fun of this new merchant class in her novel Pride and Prejudice. There is a character in Pride and Prejudice called Mr. Lucas, and he has amassed much wealth, but he has not achieved any social recognition in his life, and for that purpose he wants to give away his business, and he wants to aspire to be a landed one of the landed gentry, and that is how she has ridiculed this class, this new business class. England in Industrial Revolution completely changed the way society looked at itself, and I want to quote something from a novel called Sibyl, written by Benjamin Disraeli. I quote, "Two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings, as if they were dwellers in different zones," unquote. And as a result of Industrial Revolution, family life suffered complete disintegration, and Jane Austen did not approve of this, and as I said earlier, she was not in favor of something that could upset the apple cart, that could upset the recognized social order, and therefore she has indirectly criticized Industrial Revolution in her novels. So now I request Rucha ma'am to please say us something about her major novels.
Yes, but before that, let me show you some of the slides about the historical background. That is, when Austen was 22, Napoleon was leading his army across Europe, as Vaibhav said, and England realized Napoleon's imminent invasion, and Austen was composing Northanger Abbey at that time. She had already finished Eleanor and Marianne and First Impressions. So she was aware of French Revolution, Napoleon's rebellion. Irish rebellion under Emmett caused great anxiety to the people of England. And Napoleon and Josephine were crowned by Pope in Paris, and Spain declared war against Great Britain. And in 1806, Napoleon declared blockade against England, and battles were fought at Saragossa, Corunna, and Albuera. Napoleon was deposed and sent to Elba while she was composing Emma. The news of Napoleon's escape from Elba surprised the world, and before Emma was published, the Battle of Waterloo had been over, and Napoleon had been confined to St. Helena. Now, Vaibhavi, feel free to add your comments to this historical background. As Graham Hugh puts it, the world of which her novels present a corner was a world in convulsion, filled with wars, revolutions, the struggle for political liberty, black repression, miserable poverty, and savage penal laws.
As Rucha ma'am said in the beginning of this lecture, if you look at the quotation that we just saw by Graham Howe, he says that the world of which her novels present a corner. Now, please keep in mind the words a corner given by Graham Howe. In a way, he seems to be saying that Jane Austen's novels are very domestic, very regional novels, and she does not have any idea of the larger perspective, because her novels present just a corner of the world. Now, that was I told you about this industrial revolution, how agricultural economy turned to capitalist economy, and the French Revolution occurred on the other side of the Atlantic, while this industrial revolution was a phenomenon that happened nearer home, and therefore it had greater impact on Jane Austen's psyche than the French Revolution. Though industrial revolution is much lesser, it had much lesser consequences than the French Revolution, because in French Revolution, men, women and children, bishops, everybody who claimed loyalty to the monarchy were brutally killed, while in this industrial revolution there was no bloodshed, literally, but it had the potential to completely unstabilize the accepted order of England.
Yeah, as you can see on your screen, it was new techniques and machines in the textile industries, and enclosure of common lands had a devastating effect upon the cotton industry, as Vaibhav said, and the famed English countryside started depopulating, and the manufacturing towns rapidly expanded. For example, between 1800 and 1840, Birmingham, Sheffield and Leicester doubled their population. So this is the effect of industrial revolution. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, as if England had been divided into two halves. And Vaibhav quoted from Disraeli, as he described it in Sibyl, that the two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings, as if they were dwellers in different zones. So this is a devastating effect of industrial revolution, and it is also because of industrial revolution family life suffered disintegration, and this was in stark contrast to Austen's idea of stability in life, and she did not approve of anything that could upset the state of order and balance in life. Now, friends, I thank Vaibhav for giving us such a thorough information about the historical background. Now you can see this is the first page of Sense and Sensibility, the original cover page of the novel which was published in 1811. It was not by Jane Austen but by a lady. And Sense and Sensibility, it was first written in 1795 as Elinor and Marian. These are the two major characters in the novel, and Austen wanted to publish the novel as Elinor and Marian, but as I said in the beginning, that the manuscript was directly rejected by the publisher. It got published in 1811, and now you can see the major characters in Sense and Sensibility. It was also first written in epistolary style in the Richardson's fashion, but then while during the publication, Jane Austen made it into third-person narrative. These are the major characters: Elinor and Marian, Mr. and Mrs. Dashwood, John and Fanny Dashwood, Sir John Middleton, and Mrs. Middleton. Now, it happens that Mr. and Mrs. Dashwood, they have 3 daughters, Elinor, Marian, and there is also third daughter, Margaret. Mr. Dashwood has a son called John from his first wife, and his wife is Fanny Dashwood. In the beginning of the novel, Mr. Dashwood dies, and he gives away his property to his sole heir, John, who is the boy, and according to the law of England, the property goes to the boy. So John gets his property. Mrs. Dashwood and her 3 daughters, they are left without any financial background. Now it happens that John and Fanny, those who live away from Norland Park, that is Mr. Dashwood's property, they come to stay with Mrs. Dashwood and her 3 daughters, and there Edward Ferrars, who is the brother of Fanny, he comes, and Elinor falls in love with Edward Ferrars. But during that time, Mrs. Dashwood decides to go away from Norland Park. They go to some other place that is owned by Mr. Middleton, who is a distant cousin of Mrs. Dashwood. There, Mr. Dashwood's mother-in-law, Mrs. Jennings, she gets a project to find a suitable match for all the 3 girls. So she introduces Marian to Colonel Brandon. Now Marian finds him a very difficult person, because Brandon is a very serious kind of guy, and he is also 35 years of age, almost 17 years older than Marian. So she disapproves this proposal, and then Marian, she meets some John Willoughby. Willoughby is a very dashing young man who is interested in poetry, art, music, as Vaibhav said. That Willoughby is a person who talks about all the literature. But he cheats upon Marian. He runs away with some other woman, and then Marian matures. During that time, Edward Ferrars also comes and proposes to Elinor, and all the characters, they reconcile. And Sense stands for purity, for logic. Sensibility stands for emotion. So Elinor stands for logic, and Marian stands for emotions, that is impulsive